She was standing in the middle of a room full of people celebrating a man who had once promised to love her, wearing a smile that cost her everything she had left. When she realized that some betrayals don't come from enemies, they come from the people who taught you what family was supposed to feel like. Zaria Bennett had survived 26 years of being the wrong daughter in the wrong household, and she had done it quietly, without drama, without complaint. But tonight, the man she had loved was putting a ring on her sister's finger, and Zaria's mother was clapping. If you've ever been erased by the people who were supposed to choose you, stay with me. This story is for you. Watch until the very end, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The invitation had arrived on a Tuesday, which Zaria would later think was the cruelest detail of all. Not a Friday, when she could have lost herself in the noise of the weekend. Not a Monday, when the week's demands would have dulled the edge of it. A Tuesday, which was the most ordinary day of the ordinary life she had spent 26 years trying to survive, and it arrived in a pale cream envelope with gold script lettering, and her name spelled with the careful, deliberate precision of someone who wanted to make sure she understood exactly what she was being invited to witness. Mr. and Mrs. Han cordially invite Miss Zaria Bennett to celebrate the engagement of Han Yuna and Park Jae-min. She read it twice, then a third time. Not because the words were unclear, but because she needed her brain to catch up with what her body already knew. Her hands had gone cold the moment she touched the envelope. Her stomach had dropped before she even broke the seal. Some part of her had recognized, on a cellular level, what was inside before she ever opened it. And now she stood in her small kitchen in the apartment she rented in Mapo-gu, the one her mother had never once visited despite living 20 minutes away by car. And she read the name Park Jae-min printed in gold ink until it stopped looking like letters and became just shapes. Meaningless shapes on expensive paper. Park Jae-min. She set the invitation down on the counter with the same careful deliberateness that a person uses when they're trying very hard not to throw something. Then she turned, walked to the sink, turned the cold water on, and put both wrists under it. She had learned that trick from an old therapist she'd seen briefly at 22, during the last time Jae-min had broken her heart. Cool water on the pulse points when the feelings get too big for the body to hold. She hadn't thought about that therapist in years. Funny how the body keeps the score. She had met Park Jae-min when she was 21 and he was 24, at one of her stepfather's interminable business dinners that she'd been required to attend as a decorative accessory to the family's carefully curated image of success. He had been introduced to the table as a young executive from a finance family, third-generation money, the kind of quiet wealth that didn't need to announce itself because everyone in the room already knew. He had dark eyes and a calm, measured way of speaking that made her feel like he was actually listening, which was so rare in that world that she'd nearly wept from the simple shock of it. They had dated for 14 months. She had believed, with the specific and devastating certainty of someone who has never quite felt chosen, that he was the person she had been waiting for. Not because he was wealthy, not because her stepfamily approved of him, they hadn't particularly, which had been part of the appeal, but because he was the first person who seemed to see her rather than the color of her skin against the backdrop of a Korean family that had never entirely known what to do with her. Her mother, Choi Eun-hee, had married Han Sung-jae when Zaria was 7 years old. Her biological father was a Black American musician who had loved her mother briefly and completely, and then returned to Atlanta when the relationship collapsed under the weight of practical incompatibility and cultural distance. Zaria did not remember him well. She remembered the smell of a particular cologne and the sound of someone laughing loudly in the next room and the feeling of large hands lifting her above someone's head. That was all. He had died in a car accident when she was 11, which closed the chapter on that particular wound before she'd been old enough to properly process it. Han Sung-jae had been kind to her in the abstract, distant way of a man who simply didn't know what to do with a child who looked nothing like him, and nothing like his daughter, and nothing like anything his world had prepared him to navigate. He hadn't been cruel. He hadn't been warm. He had been a man who provided a large house in Gangnam and a private school education and a monthly clothing allowance, and considered this a comprehensive fulfillment of his parental obligations. And perhaps in the narrow accounting system of his emotional vocabulary, it was his daughter. Yuna was 3 years younger than Zaria and beautiful with the specific camera-ready beauty of someone who has been told their whole life that beauty is their primary value. She had her father's jaw and her mother's eyes, her biological mother's eyes, the first wife, the one who had died when Yuna was 4 and who occupied the sacred martyr position in the family's emotional architecture that no living woman could compete with. Yuna had grown up soft and demanding and accustomed to every room organizing itself around her comfort, and she and Zarya had existed in the same household for 19 years in a state of carefully managed mutual antipathy that masqueraded at family gatherings as indifference. Zarya had never told anyone in the family about Jai-min. That was the part she kept coming back to, under the cold water, in her small kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon. She had kept the relationship private from her stepfamily for reasons she hadn't examined too closely at the time. Some combination of wanting something that was only hers, and the low, shameful knowledge that she didn't entirely trust them not to ruin it. She had been right not to trust them, as it turned out. She simply hadn't anticipated the specific mechanism of the ruination. Jaemin had ended things with her 18 months ago. No dramatic confrontation, no final argument. He had simply become gradually, efficiently absent, less responsive, more distracted, increasingly unavailable, until the relationship had died by 1,000 small withdrawals, and she had eventually stopped reaching out because she had too much pride to keep reaching toward someone who was clearly no longer reaching back. It had hurt with the particular bone-deep ache of something you never got to properly grieve, because there had been no clean ending, only the slow recognition that it was already over. She had not known, until this invitation, that he had met Yuna. She did not know how long. She did not know when. She did not know whether the overlap was the reason he had pulled away from her, or whether Yuna had come after, filling the space Zarya had vacated. She was not sure, standing there with her wrists under cold water, which version would hurt more. Her phone rang. Her mother's name on the screen. She turned off the tap. She stared at the phone for the 4 seconds it took the rational part of her brain to override the part that wanted to throw it against the wall. Then she answered. "You received the invitation," her mother said. Not a question. "I did. It would mean a great deal to Yuna if you attended." Zarya said nothing for a moment. She was measuring her words the way you measure medicine, carefully, mindful of the dosage, aware that the wrong amount in either direction causes damage. "How long?" she finally said. A pause. Brief but not imperceptible. "Zarya, how long have they been together? That isn't—" "Mom." The word came out harder than she intended. It always did. The word had angles on it because the relationship had angles on it. Because 20 years of living inside a family that loved you theoretically and failed you specifically left marks that expressed themselves in the voice at unguarded moments. "How long?" "About a year," her mother said, and Yoon-hee's voice had the particular quality of someone navigating a minefield they themselves helped to lay. "Zarya, I didn't know at first that you had known him. By the time I understood the situation, they were already serious, and I didn't want to— I need to go. The dinner is Saturday. It would be— I heard you, I need to go." She ended the call. She put the phone face down on the counter. She stood in her kitchen for a very long time, looking at nothing in particular, while the afternoon light moved across the wall and the city outside her window continued to exist with its customary indifference to individual suffering. She told herself she wasn't going to attend. That lasted approximately 3 days. The Han family's ability to manufacture obligation out of thin air was one of the truly remarkable things about them. Zarya had spent 2 decades watching it happen and still could not entirely explain the mechanism. It was not threats exactly. It was not explicit manipulation. It was the accumulation of small remarks, each individually deniable, collectively suffocating. Her mother mentioning, in the same exhausted tone she'd used for 20 years, how much it would hurt everyone if Zarya couldn't put aside her personal feelings for one evening. Her stepfather's assistant calling to confirm her attendance, as if her attendance were already confirmed. A text from Yuna that read, "I hope to see you Saturday," with no acknowledgement of anything, just that flat, implacable hope, like a stone dropped into still water. She went. She spent 45 minutes getting dressed, which was 35 minutes longer than usual, and she spent most of that time having a running argument with herself in the bathroom mirror about what she was doing and why, and she still couldn't entirely answer the second part. She put on the one dress she owned that made her feel like more than what she was, a deep burgundy wrap dress that she'd bought on sale and saved for occasions that required her to feel armored. And she did her makeup with the methodical focus of someone prepping for surgery, and she looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment before she left. She looked fine. She looked like a woman who had everything under control. She was a magnificent liar when properly motivated. The restaurant the Han family had chosen was the kind of place that didn't post its menu prices online, which was itself a statement. It occupied the top floor of a Gangnam hotel, all floor-to-ceiling glass and low lighting, and the hushed, reverential atmosphere of very expensive spaces, and the hostess who greeted Zarya at the elevator wore the careful, professional blankness of someone paid to register nothing and reflect everything. Zarya gave her name. The hostess checked the list. Found it. Probably near the bottom, she thought, in the category of necessary presences rather than celebrated ones, and led her through to the private dining room where the evening was already underway. The room was full when she entered. 20, maybe 25 people arranged around a long table set with white flowers and crystal and the warm, flattering light that money bought for its most important evenings. She registered faces in quick succession, step-family adjacent, business associates of her stepfather's, several people she didn't know. And then, with the inevitability of gravity, her eyes found Jae-min. He was at the head of the table beside Yuna, and he was exactly as she remembered him, and also entirely different in the way that people become when they are happily positioned inside a life that once included you. He looked comfortable. He looked like he belonged there. He had his hand resting on the back of Yuna's chair with the proprietorial ease of a man who has already decided where he is going, and Yuna was leaning slightly toward him in the unconscious way of women who know they are adored. And Zarya stood in the doorway for one breath, just one, before she shut whatever was opening inside her chest and walked into the room. She found her place card near the end of the table, predictably distant from the center of celebration. She sat down, smiled at the woman beside her, who she vaguely recognized as a friend of her mother's, accepted a glass of wine from a passing server with the practiced grace of someone who has been attending gatherings they didn't want to be at for their entire adult life, and began the work of surviving the evening. It was going tolerably well, in the grim way that tolerably describes, until dessert. She couldn't reconstruct afterward exactly how it happened. There had been toasts. Her stepfather's toast was long and elaborate and self-congratulatory in the way of men who view their daughter's engagement primarily as a reflection of their own social achievement, and then some reorganization of seating that brought Jae-min and Yuna closer to her end of the table, and then a moment where the conversation lulled and Jae-min looked at her across a gap of maybe 4 feet and said, with the mild conversational tone of someone making a harmless observation, "I heard you're still in event coordination. Small work, but I suppose it suits you." The table didn't go entirely silent, but it quieted. The particular quieting of a room where something has been said that everyone heard and no one will acknowledge. Yuna smiled into her wine glass with the specific, pleased micro-expression of someone who has been waiting for exactly this. Zarya's mother looked at the table. Small work, but I suppose it suits you. She had been invisible her whole life, and she had survived it by making herself smaller and smaller and smaller, until she fit inside the space people had decided was appropriate for her, and she had done it with grace, and done it with silence, and done it with the quiet, corrosive dignity of someone who has decided that preservation matters more than pride. She was tired of it. She was so tired of it that the exhaustion lived in her molars and behind her eyes, and in the specific heaviness of her shoulders at the end of every day. She didn't plan what happened next. She was genuinely operating on something beyond rational decision-making, some deep animal survival instinct that had finally reached its ceiling and turned around. She turned slightly in her chair and looked at the man sitting 2 tables away in the partial shadow of the room's far corner, the one who had been there when she arrived, the one she had registered on entry and then professionally ignored as one ignores anything in one's immediate environment that radiates that specific density of physical authority and social danger. She had heard of Seo Kong-jun. Everyone in Seoul's intersecting circles of money and power had heard of Seo Kong-jun. He was 34 years old and ran a business empire that was officially listed in commercial real estate and private equity and several other anodyne categories that appeared, on paper, entirely legitimate. He was also, depending on who you asked and how reliable their information was, the operating force behind half the shadow governance of Seoul's underworld, the man who settled disputes between families, who controlled the infrastructure that other organizations depended on, who had built, over a decade and from genuinely brutal origins, The kind of power that didn't need to advertise because its reputation preceded it by several rooms. He had dark, still eyes and a quality of physical presence that occupied more space than his actual body required, the way that truly dangerous people always do. He was sitting alone, which was unusual for the kind of man he was, and he was watching the room with the unhurried attention of someone for whom observation was a professional skill. She had approximately 2 seconds to decide. She took them. Then she looked back at Jae-min, and she smiled. A real smile, not the performed one she'd been maintaining all evening, something edged and private and entirely genuine in its complete refusal to be diminished, and said, "It's sweet that you're keeping track of my work. My boyfriend prefers I stay busy when he's in meetings." The pause that followed had texture. She could feel it. Jaemin's eyes moved to hers with the first real attention he'd given her all evening. "Your boyfriend." She reached for her water glass with the unhurried ease of a woman who was not currently constructing a fiction that could detonate her life. "He was insistent about accompanying me tonight, but I told him it was a family dinner. He worries." "Who is he?" This was her mother, which was a kind of additional punishment Zarya hadn't anticipated. She said it without entirely meaning to. The name came out of her mouth the way things come when the body is running faster than the brain. A survival reflex, a last-second move. The kind of decision that looks like recklessness, but is actually the final product of years of pressure, finding its single exit point. "Seo Kang-jun," she said. The room changed, not dramatically, not loudly. But the quality of the air in it shifted in the specific way of spaces where information has just landed that reorganizes the social gravity of everything. She heard her mother make a small, involuntary sound. She saw Jae-min's expression shift from amusement to something more careful. She saw her stepfather look up from his wine with the alert, calculating attention of a businessman processing new information about the landscape. And then she became aware, with the cold clarity of someone who has made a very significant error, that she could feel eyes on her from across the room. From the table in the far corner. From a man who had apparently heard his own name. She did not look. She kept her eyes on the center of the table and maintained the expression of a woman who is entirely comfortable with what she has just said, while internally she was conducting a very rapid and not particularly encouraging assessment of her available options, which were limited, which were essentially none, which were... The room changed again. She heard it in the quality of the silence before she understood it. The subtle collective adjustment of people becoming aware that something was moving toward them. Then a hand landed on her shoulder. Not rough, not aggressive. Simply present, with the weight and certainty of someone who has never in their life needed to prove a point twice. She looked up. Seo Kang-jun was standing behind her chair, and he was looking at the table in general, and Jae-min in particular, and his expression was the most neutrally pleasant expression she had ever seen on a human face that nevertheless communicated, with absolute clarity, something that made every person at the table become very still. "She's with me," he said. His voice was calm, not soft. Calm, which was different, which was the difference between a sleeping thing and a still thing. He said it the way you state a fact about geography. The sky is above us. The floor is beneath us. She is with me. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds and felt considerably longer. Then he looked down at her, and his eyes were dark and completely unreadable, and he said quietly, for her alone, "Shall we go?" And Zarya Bennett, who had spent 26 years being the woman who stayed and smiled and endured, stood up from the table, picked up her small clutch, and walked out of the room beside the most dangerous man in Seoul without looking back once. The elevator was private, accessed by a key that materialized in Kang-jun's hand with the smoothness of a man accustomed to moving through the world with zero friction, and they wrote it down in silence. Not uncomfortable silence, something more charged than that, with the specific atmospheric quality of two people who have just done something together and are both in the process of working out what it means. The lobby of the hotel was wide and white, and mostly empty at this hour, and he walked her toward a bank of windows overlooking the street rather than toward the exit, which told her this wasn't over. She had known it wasn't over. She had known from the moment he touched her shoulder that this was a different kind of problem than the one she'd walked into that restaurant with, which was saying something. She spoke first because standing in silence while a man like Seo Kang-jun studied you was not a sustainable condition. "Thank you," she said. "You didn't have to do that." "No," he agreed. "I didn't. I'm sorry. I said your name without... I didn't think it through. He studied her for a moment with those dark, still eyes. Up close, he was different from how he'd appeared across the restaurant. Less like an abstraction, more like a specific person, which was somehow more unnerving. There was a small scar through his left eyebrow, old enough to be pale, and he had the particular physical stillness of someone who had learned to be economical with movement in environments where movement had consequences. Who are you? He asked. Zaria Bennett. My mother is Choi Eun-hee. She married Han Sung-jae. Something moved across his expression at the name Han. Brief. Calibrating. The man at the head of the table. Yes. And the man you said was your boyfriend, Park Jae-min, you know him. It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway because she was tired and because lying to this specific man seemed like a category error. We dated. He's marrying my stepsister. I was there to watch it happen. He absorbed this with no visible reaction. Then, why his name? Why mine specifically? It was a fair question. She had been asking herself the same thing in the elevator and was not fully satisfied with the answer. You were the most dangerous person in the room, she said, because she had decided honesty was the only viable currency here. Jaemin needed to feel what it was like to be the smaller thing for once. Kongjun looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted by a degree so small she almost missed it. And now? He said. What happens when the story spreads that Seo Kongjun was at that table and confirmed it? I don't know, she said. I hadn't thought that far. It will spread, he said simply. By morning. She closed her eyes briefly, opened them. I'm sorry. I'll correct it. I'll say I misspoke, or that makes it worse. He said it without irritation, with the flat, practical certainty of someone assessing a tactical situation. A retraction invites more questions than the original claim. Then what do you suggest? He looked at her for another of those long, measuring moments that she was beginning to recognize as a processing habit, the outward stillness of an extremely fast internal calculation. Then he said, Are you working tomorrow? The question was so unexpected that she almost didn't answer. It's Wednesday. I have a client meeting at 10. After that? I'm free afternoon. Then you'll come to my office at 1 o'clock, he said. We'll discuss the details. He produced a card from his jacket, plain, matte black, just a name and a number, and held it out to her. Unless you'd prefer to handle the fallout on your own. She took the card. She looked at it, then at him. Why are you doing this? He didn't answer immediately. And when he spoke, the words were deliberate in the way of things said by someone who almost never explains themselves. Han Sung-jae owes a significant amount of money to several people I know. The Park family has been a subject of my attention for some time. Your situation may be convenient. He paused, and something that might have been the ghost of an expression passed over his face. And you chose my name specifically because I was the most dangerous option available. That suggests better judgment than most. He inclined his head with the minimal courtesy of a man for whom elaborate social gestures are unnecessary, then turned and walked toward the exit, where a black car was already waiting at the curb with the specific, practiced precision of an organization that anticipated every movement before it happened. Zaria stood in the hotel lobby with his card in her hand, and the remnants of an evening she hadn't survived so much as detonated, and she looked at her own reflection in the darkened glass of the window. And the woman who looked back at her was slightly disheveled and entirely off balance, and more alive than she had felt in a very long time. She slept badly. She woke early. She sat with her coffee and the matte black card, and she told herself multiple times that the rational decision was to call the number and cancel. That inserting herself into the orbit of a man like Seo Kong-jun was not a correction to the problems of her life, but an acceleration of them. That she had acted impulsively in a moment of pain, and the adult thing to do now was to absorb the consequences quietly and move on. She was very convincing. She had spent her whole life being very convincing on the subject of accepting what the room decided to give her. At 12:45 the next day, she got in a cab and gave the driver the address on the card. Oh, his building was in Yeongdong-PO, which was not where she had expected. She had been imagining Gangnam, the glass towers of conspicuous success. But she revised her understanding immediately when the cab pulled up to it. It was a mid-rise, dark glass and reinforced steel, nothing about the exterior that announced itself, and she understood that this was intentional. A building that didn't need to impress because the people who needed to know already knew. There was a reception desk in the lobby staffed by a woman in her 30s who had the focused, unflappable quality of someone who processed things well above her pay grade without visibly registering any of it, and she checked Zaria's ID with a process that was brief but not casual, and she was accompanied to the elevator by a man in a dark suit who said nothing, and whose presence was itself a statement about the infrastructure of access in this building. The office on the 14th floor was large and ordered and bare in a way that felt like choice rather than absence. A desk, several chairs, a wall of windows looking west toward the river, and a table where Seo Kang-jun was already standing when she entered, talking to someone on his phone in a tone so quiet she could barely hear the words. He raised a hand to indicate she should sit, which she did, and she used the 90 seconds it took him to finish the call to regulate her breathing and remind herself that she was a person who had managed difficult situations before. He ended the call and turned to face her, and he was wearing the kind of clothes that cost the same as her monthly rent, and wearing them with the complete indifference of a man to whom this is simply the texture of daily life. And he looked at her for a moment with that same measuring quality as the night before. "You came," he said. "You didn't think I would?" "I gave it 60%, he said, which was a specific enough answer that she found herself surprised by it. "What made you uncertain?" "You seem sensible," he said. "Sensible people generally avoid situations like this one. And yet you suggested it." A corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. More like an acknowledgement that the point was valid. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and he folded his hands on the table with the relaxed authority of a man who is never in a hurry because time arranges itself around him. "Here's what I'm proposing," he said. "The story is already circulating. By last night, it had reached 3 people outside that room. By now, it's considerably more. The most efficient response is not a retraction. It is a confirmation." She looked at him steadily. "You're suggesting we pretend to be in a relationship. For a defined period, 6 to 8 weeks. Enough time for the relevant parties to adjust their calculations, and for certain business matters I have with the Han and Park families to reach their natural conclusions." He paused. "In that time you would move to my residence. I would not move anywhere. For security purposes," he continued, with the unperturbed quality of a man who expected obstacles and considered them data rather than problems. "There are people connected to the Park family who will, if they believe this story, attempt to verify it or undermine it. You being in my building is not an aesthetic choice. It is a practical one." She looked at him. He looked back at her with absolute patience. "And what do I get," she said, "besides security from a problem you and I collectively created last night?" "Protection from your family," he said, and the words were so precisely placed that they landed without cruelty, but without softness either. "A position, resources. And by the end of 8 weeks, a situation in which the people who have managed you for 26 years no longer have any leverage." She was silent for a moment. Outside the windows, the Han River moved in the afternoon light, gray and indifferent and enormous. "You know nothing about me," she said. "I know more than you think," he said, which was the truest and most disturbing thing he had said yet. And she should have asked him to explain it, and she didn't. And she would spend a very long time later wondering whether everything that followed might have been different if she had pressed him on it in that moment, in that quiet room, before she nodded and said yes. But she nodded, and she said yes. And the life she had been living, the careful, diminished, survivable life, ended in that moment as finally as if someone had drawn a line through it, and something else, something she could not yet name or measure or trust, began. The car that collected her things arrived on Thursday morning. Not a moving truck. She hadn't expected a moving truck, hadn't imagined that a man like Seo Kang-jun operated in the register of moving trucks. But a black SUV with 2 men who carried boxes with the efficient, wordless competence of people, for whom this was a routine task, and who did not comment on the smallness of her apartment or the modest inventory of her life, and who were finished in under 40 minutes. She had packed herself. That had been important to her in a way she couldn't entirely explain but didn't feel the need to justify. She packed her own clothes, her own books, the framed photograph of her and her college roommate taken at a beach in Busan 6 years ago. That was the only personal photograph she displayed, the good coffee maker she had saved 3 months to buy, and the small collection of business planning notebooks she'd kept since she started her event coordination company 2 years ago. She left the rest. There wasn't much rest. She stood in the empty apartment for a moment after the last box went out, in the particular silence of a vacated space that still carries the shape of a life. She had lived here 3 years. She had been mostly alone here and occasionally lonely here and always, underneath everything, slightly temporary here, as if she were waiting for the real version of her life to begin, and this was the waiting room. She did not feel sentimental about leaving it. That bothered her a little, because she thought perhaps she should. She turned off the lights and pulled the door shut and did not look back. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a residential tower in Yongsan-gu, which meant she woke the first morning to a view of the Han River that was so wide and gray and genuinely beautiful that she stood at the window for several minutes doing nothing except looking at it, and she felt something complicated about the fact that the most beautiful view she had ever had from any room she'd slept in had arrived via the most precarious circumstances of her adult life. The apartment was large in the way that reflected serious, considered wealth, not the aggressive display of new money, but the settled, functional luxury of someone who had owned beautiful things long enough to stop being impressed by them. Clean lines, muted colors, art on the walls that looked real in a way she wasn't qualified to assess, a kitchen with professional-grade appliances that appeared entirely unused, which tracked with what she was learning about how Kangjun operated. I was almost never there. This was the thing she hadn't anticipated, which was its own kind of embarrassing. She had spent the cab ride to her new life managing her nervousness about proximity to a man who was, by any reasonable accounting, alarming, and what she found instead was absence. He had a room. She had a room. There was a housekeeper named Mrs. Yoon who arrived every weekday morning and communicated with Zarya through a combination of minimal Korean and expressive nonverbal efficiency. There were 2 security personnel stationed in the building at all times, one in the lobby and one in the hallway outside the penthouse floor, who were polite and invisible in the specific way of trained professionals. Kangjun himself moved through the space like weather, present periodically, usually at night, always briefly, and gone before she had fully registered he'd been there. On the 4th day, she came out of her room at 7 in the morning to find him standing at the kitchen counter, drinking coffee and reading something on his phone, still in his shirt from the night before with the collar open, and he looked up when she appeared in the doorway and said, "There's coffee," with exactly the same inflection he might have used to indicate a traffic update. "Thank you," she said. She poured herself a cup. She sat at the counter across from him at what she assessed as a distance that communicated neither approach nor retreat. He was still reading. She looked at the river. "Do you sleep here?" she asked. He didn't look up. "Sometimes." "You weren't here Wednesday. Meeting ran late." A pause, and then he looked at her, and the look had that quality she was beginning to understand as his version of attention. Not warm, but complete. He gave you all of it when he gave any of it. Is that a problem? "No," she said. "I was establishing parameters." "The parameters," he said, "are that you have full access to this space, to a car and driver if you need one, and to a security escort if you leave on personal business. Business calls, photographs, appearances will be scheduled through my assistant, Ji Yeon. She'll contact you." "What kind of appearances?" "Dinners, a few public locations, events where being seen together has strategic value." He set his phone down and picked up his coffee. "I'm not asking you to perform. I'm asking you to exist in the same space occasionally. And when people ask me things about us, keep it vague, long enough that the timeline doesn't invite scrutiny, close enough that the details don't conflict." He paused. "You'll have questions from your family within the week. Your mother will call. She's already called." Something moved across his face. "What did she say?" "She wanted to know if it was true. I told her yes." Zarya looked at her coffee. "She wanted to know how long. I told her a few months. She wanted to know why I hadn't told the family." She set the mug down with a small, precise motion. "I told her I wasn't in the habit of sharing things with people who weren't interested in them." Kangjun was quiet for a moment. "And she said I was being unfair." Zarya smiled without humor. "She's been saying that my whole life. It means she can't find a better argument." He watched her for a moment with that full, complete attention. Then he said, "You're good at this." "At what?" "Surviving things that should have broken you." He said it without sentiment, the way you'd note a useful mechanical property. Then he picked up his phone again, and the conversation was apparently over, and she sat with her coffee and the river view and the complicated, unwelcome warmth of having been accurately seen by someone she hadn't given permission to look. Ji-yeon was 30, relentlessly efficient, and communicated in the clipped, information-dense shorthand of someone for whom words were a resource to be conserved. She called Zarya on Friday afternoon and outlined 3 upcoming appearances: a business dinner the following Wednesday, a Saturday event at a gallery opening in Insadong, and a lunch meeting 2 weeks out where Kong Jun would be meeting with a real estate consortium that included, as Zarya noted with a specific internal sensation she identified as the intersection of useful and nauseating, Han Sung-jae. "My stepfather," she said. "Yes," Jiyeon said. "Mr. Seo is aware." "What does he want from that meeting?" "That's not information I have for you," which was its own kind of answer. She thanked Jiyeon and ended the call and sat at the desk in her room with her event coordination notebook open in front of her and wrote nothing in it for several minutes, thinking instead about the specific phrasing Kong Jun had used in his office on Wednesday. "Certain business matters I have with the Han and Park families." She had accepted this without pressing it because she had been in a state of controlled internal crisis at the time, and because pressing Seo Kong Jun for information he hadn't offered seemed like the kind of thing that required more ground than she'd had. She had ground now. She was sleeping in his apartment and eating from his refrigerator and being managed by his assistant. She had made a calculation, and she was living inside it, and if she was going to survive it with her judgment intact, she needed to understand what she had walked into. She called Ji-yeon back. "I need a meeting with him, 30 minutes, this week." A brief pause. "I'll check his schedule. Tell him I said it's not negotiable." Another pause, slightly longer. "I'll tell him." He came home that night at 10:30, and she was still up, which was partly insomnia and partly determination, and when she heard the elevator and then the front door, she came out of her room and she said, "I need 30 minutes. He looked at her with that still, calibrating gaze. He was carrying his jacket over one arm, and he looked tired in the controlled way of someone who manages their tiredness the way they manage everything else, strategically, without public acknowledgement. "Now? You're here now." He set his jacket over the back of a chair and moved to the kitchen. "You want coffee? It's 10:30. That wasn't an offer. That was an inquiry." He was already filling the machine. "Sit down." She sat at the counter. He made coffee with the economical precision of a man who has made it alone in a silent kitchen at late hours often enough that the movements are entirely automatic. And he set 2 cups on the counter and sat across from her and said, "Ask. What are you after with my stepfather?" "Debt restructuring." "What does that mean?" "He borrowed money from parties who are connected to me. Restructuring means renegotiating the terms of that debt in a direction that is more useful to my interests. He owes you money. He owes money to people I do business with. The distinction matters legally." His voice was flat and factual. "The Han family's financial situation is more complicated than their lifestyle suggests. They've been managing a liquidity problem for about 3 years. She looked at him steadily. "And the Parks?" Something shifted in his expression by a fraction. "The Park family has interests that conflict with several of my business arrangements. Jae-min's father has been actively working to undermine a property acquisition I've been building toward for 2 years. So getting close to you was not a planned variable," he said. "Your name at my table was unplanned." My response was a calculation made in approximately 4 seconds. He paused. "The calculation has become useful beyond what I initially projected. Because being seen with me puts pressure on both families." "Yes." "And the protection you offered me is real," he said. His voice changed slightly on that, hardened by a degree that wasn't aggression, but finality, the tone of someone correcting a fact. "The protection is not a performance. When I said you're with me, that was a statement with consequences. No one in my world will touch anything connected to me." He looked at her. "That includes you." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the windows, the river was dark, and the city lights doubled themselves in the water, and the world was very large, and she was sitting in the middle of something whose full dimensions she still couldn't see. "I'm not nothing in this arrangement," she said. "I need you to understand that. I know you're not nothing. That's not the same as understanding it." She looked at him directly. "I will do what we agreed. I'll be present when you need me present, and I'll handle my family, and I'll make the story credible. But I am not a piece to be moved. If you use me for something without telling me first, I will walk out of this building and correct every story and take whatever comes from that." He met her eyes. The look lasted several seconds, and she didn't look away. "Understood," he said. It should have felt like a small thing. It didn't feel small. In the particular architecture of how she had been treated by people with power over her life, being told understood in a tone that meant it was a significant structural event, and she hated that it was, and she absorbed it anyway because that was the truth of her history. She picked up her coffee. He picked up his. And they sat in the strange, charged quiet of two people who have just established something that neither of them entirely has a name for, while the city moved outside and the night pressed against the glass. The Wednesday dinner was at a private club in Hanam-dong that she had heard of but never entered, and she wore a dress that Ji-yeon had arranged to be delivered, black, structured, expensive in the precise understated way of Kang Jun's world. And she rode in the car beside him in a silence that was different from their kitchen silences. More public. More performed. She was aware of being looked at before they even arrived. He opened her door himself when the car stopped. Not performance, or not only performance. He did it with the same economy of motion he applied to everything, and he touched the small of her back briefly as they walked in, light enough that she almost didn't feel it, except that she did feel it, and her body's notation of that fact was irritating and irrelevant and thoroughly noted regardless. The dinner was 8 people. Finance, real estate, the kind of men who operated in those gray sectors between legitimate business and the kind of arrangements that were never written down. She sat beside him, and she did what she was there to do. She was present, she was fluent, she engaged the conversation at the table with the social competence she had developed over 26 years of navigating rooms where she was an outlier and had chosen professionalism over withdrawal as her survival strategy. She watched him work. That was the other thing she did, and she did it with the careful attention of someone filing information they don't yet know the use of. He was different in this room than he was in the apartment. Not false. The stillness was the same, the economy of expression was the same, but amplified. The men at this table watched him the way people watch weather, with the mixture of respect and wariness that belongs to things powerful enough to be dangerous. He spoke rarely, and when he spoke, people listened with the focused attention of people who understood that information from this source came without repetition. At one point, the man across from her, mid-50s, with the look of someone who had made most of his money in ways he preferred not to specify, looked at her with a quality of attention that was not hostile but was definitely assessing, and said, "CO never brought anyone before, didn't think that was his way." She felt Kang Jun's stillness beside her shift almost imperceptibly. She smiled at the man across the table and said, "People change their way when the right person comes along." She paused. "Or so I'm told." The man laughed. Kang Jun said nothing, but under the table his hand found hers briefly, 2 seconds, a contact that was gone before she could decide what it meant, and she kept her expression exactly as it was and did not look at him. They were back in the car at 11. The city moved outside the windows. She was looking at her hands in her lap when he said, without preamble, "You handled that well." "I've been handling rooms that didn't entirely want me for a long time," she said. "I have a system." He was quiet. Then, "What's the system?" "Find the one person in the room who's paying real attention and talk to them. Let the people performing for each other perform." She looked out the window. "You were paying real attention. So was the man across from me, which is why I addressed him directly." She felt him look at her in the dark of the car. "Kim Dong-soo," he said. "He controls 3 of the port facilities in Incheon. Is he important to what you're building?" "He will be." She nodded. "Then you're welcome." And in the dark, in the car moving through the lit streets of the city, she heard something that was not quite a sound, more like the adjustment of breath. The smallest exhalation that in a person with less control would have been a laugh, and she found herself pressing her lips together to hold her own expression in place. The first call from Yuna came on a Thursday, 12 days into what Zarya had started thinking of, in the privacy of her own head, as the arrangement. She had been expecting it. She had been expecting it with the resigned certainty of someone waiting for a particular season to arrive. And when the name appeared on her screen, she set down the proposal she'd been editing, stood up, walked to the window, and answered. "Unni," Yuna said, using the Korean honorific with the specific calculated warmth she deployed when she wanted something, the warmth that always made Zarya's back teeth press together. "I've been trying to reach you." "I saw. I've been busy." "I can imagine." A pause, perfectly timed. "It's quite the surprise, Kang Jun-si. Everyone's talking." "I'm sure they are." "How long has it been going on? Really?" The question was wrapped in a tone of sisterly intimacy that they had never once actually had. "You can tell me." I did tell you, a few months. Right before Jae-min and I got together, Yuna said, and the mildness of the delivery was its own kind of weapon. What a coincidence. Zarya looked at the river. Her reflection in the glass was a woman she recognized, controlled, careful, holding the line. Was there something you needed, Yuna? Appa's been asking about him. About Kong Jun, he's concerned. About which part? All of it. Yuna's voice shifted slightly, lost the false warmth, became something more honest, more unpleasant. You've never had anything, Zarya. You've never had this kind of... Jaemin was the only... She stopped, started again. People are saying you're living there. I am. Silence. You should be careful, Yuna said finally. Her voice was different now. Not warm, not hostile. Something that, in another relationship, might have been something closer to genuine. Men like that. They use people. And when they're done, thank you for the advice, Zarya said. I'll think about it. She ended the call. She stood at the window for a long time after that, because Yuna had said something that was true, and she was not so far gone into whatever this was that she had forgotten it. Men like that use people. It was not a wrong observation. It was, in fact, the central operational fact of the situation she had agreed to. And the part that required her honest attention was not whether it was true. It was that she had been standing in a kitchen with him at 10:30 at night and sitting beside him at a table with his hand briefly covering hers, and she was no longer thinking about the arrangement with the same clinical detachment she had started with. That was the problem. She went back to her proposal. She worked until 2 in the morning. She did not allow herself to think about it further that night. He came home late again, but she heard him this time through the wall. Not sound exactly, just the specific quality of the building's silence changing when he was in it. She had learned, over 2 weeks, that he moved very quietly for someone his size, and she'd learned to register the particular atmospheric pressure of his presence that preceded any actual sound or sight of him, which was information about herself that she filed away without examination. She was already up when he came to the kitchen, because she had been up for an hour, and she had made coffee out of habit or stress or some combination of both. And when he appeared in the doorway, she pushed the second cup toward him without being asked. He looked at it, looked at her. It's 2 in the morning. I know what time it is. He sat down. He looked tired, genuinely tired, not the managed tiredness she usually saw, but the kind that gets through the defenses when the hour is late enough and the defenses are occupied elsewhere. There was something on his face that she hadn't seen before. Not softness exactly, more like erosion. Hard night, she said. Not a question. He didn't answer immediately, which she'd learned was not evasion, but processing. Complicated, he said finally. Do you want to talk about it or not? He looked at her, and the look had something in it that she hadn't catalogued yet, a frequency she was still learning to read. Not tonight, he said. Okay. She folded her hands around her own cup. He drank his coffee. Outside the windows, the river held the city's light in long reflections that moved and broke and moved again. And the silence between them was, for the first time since she'd moved in, not the silence of 2 people managing distance, but of 2 people choosing the same quiet space deliberately. My mother came to see me today, he said after a while. She had not known he had a mother. Had known it logically, of course, but had not known it as a present fact, as a person who could arrive. Here? At the office. He was looking at the window. She does that sometimes. She doesn't call first. What did she want? To know if the story about you was real. A pause. I told her it was. What did she say? I was quiet for a moment. She said it was about time. And something in his voice on that, a very small, very suppressed thing, made her chest do something she absolutely did not have time for. She looked at her coffee. He looked at the river. The city moved below them, enormous and indifferent, and Zarya was aware with a frightening clarity that somewhere between the restaurant and the penthouse and the dinners and the 2 in the morning coffee and the not quite sounds that might have been laughter in dark cars, she had begun to lose track of what was the arrangement and what was the front door opened. Not the elevator, the front door, from the inside, which meant building security, which meant something had been cleared through the building system, and both of them came off their stools at the same speed, which told her later that they were more in sync than she had been allowing herself to register. The man who came through the door was one of Kong Jun's. She could see that immediately. Dark suit, the same contained physical quality as the men in the lobby. But his face was wrong. Not wrong like threat, wrong like news. He looked at Kong Jun and said 3 words in Korean that Zarya's language skills, still developing, caught only partially, and what she caught was enough to feel the temperature of the room change. Kang Jun's face went entirely, absolutely still. She had seen him still before. She had seen him professionally still, strategically still, the stillness he used as a tool. This was different. This was the stillness that lived before movement. The stillness of something that has just received information and has not yet decided what to do with it. He spoke to the man in a low, rapid exchange she couldn't follow, and then the man left, and Kang Jun stood with his hands flat on the kitchen counter, looking at nothing, breathing in a way that was controlled but different from his usual controlled. "What happened?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Kim Dong-soo," he said. The name was familiar. The man from the dinner, the port facilities, the one she had identified and engaged, and who he had called important to what he was building. He had a meeting this morning with Park Jae-min's father. Something cold moved through her. They've been talking for 3 weeks, he said, before the dinner, before our appearance there. He stopped. He went to our dinner and reported everything. She looked at him. He was still looking at nothing, but his jaw had tightened by a degree that spoke to something very far below the controlled surface. "What does that mean?" she said. "It means Park Jae-min's father knows the arrangement is deliberate. It means he knows where you're living." He looked at her then, and the look had an edge she hadn't seen before, not toward her but near her, the edge of a man who has encountered a problem in a sector he had considered managed. "It means the timeline I was working with is no longer accurate." "What does that mean for me?" I was quiet for a moment, and she could see him calculating with the specific, visible effort of someone whose calculation has just had a significant variable change. "It means," he said slowly, "that you can't go anywhere without security from tonight. Not your office, not client meetings, I'm not going to be managed like Zarya." His voice was quiet. Final. "The Park family does not operate the way your family does. They don't make things difficult. They make things dangerous. If Jae-min's father believes you are the fastest path to leverage over me..." He stopped. "I am not telling you this to control you. I'm telling you because last week I would have said the probability of you being a direct target was low. Tonight, I cannot say that." She looked at him in the kitchen of his penthouse, with the city burning outside and the river holding everything's reflection, and she understood, with the specific bone-deep clarity of someone who has just seen the full shape of what they stepped into, that the life she had walked away from on Thursday morning, the small apartment, the invisible existence, the survivable diminishment, was not a door she could find her way back through anymore. She had traded one kind of captivity for another, except this one had a view of the river and a man standing in it who looked at her like she mattered, and she could not entirely determine whether that made it better or considerably, dangerously. She didn't sleep. She lay in the dark of her room in the penthouse with the city's light pressing through the curtains, and her mind running the same circuit it had been running since the kitchen. The word dangerous, the look on his face, the specific quality of his stillness when he'd said, "I cannot say that." And she stared at the ceiling and breathed and told herself that she was a person who had managed difficult information before, and this was simply more difficult information and she would manage it. She did not manage it. She lay there until 4 in the morning, and then she got up and went to her desk and opened her event coordination notebook and wrote nothing in it and closed it again. At 5:30 she heard him, the specific atmospheric pressure of his presence moving through the apartment, and then the sound of the front door, quiet and definitive. She went to the window in time to see the black car pulling away from the building entrance below. He had not slept either. She registered this with the particular awareness of someone who is tracking another person more carefully than they have consciously decided to, and she pressed her forehead briefly against the cool glass of the window and said, very quietly, to no one, "Get it together." The security arrangement manifested the next morning as a man named Park Sung-ho, who was introduced to her by Ji Yeon over the phone in the same clipped, informational tone Ji Yeon used for everything, as her designated close protection detail effective immediately. He would accompany her to all external appointments. He drove. He did not discuss his employer or her arrangement with his employer. He was not there to manage her. He was there to ensure that if anyone with the park's interest decided to manage her instead, they encountered a complication. She met him in the lobby. He was mid-30s, compact, with the quiet, alert quality of former military that she was beginning to recognize as a recurring characteristic of the people in Kong Jun's immediate circle. He bowed with professional courtesy and held the door and said, "Where to, Miss Bennet?" with the practiced neutrality of someone who had been briefed extensively and intended to behave as if he hadn't. "My office," she said. Mapogu. She had a small office, technically a desk in a shared working space, where she ran her event coordination business, and she had been managing it remotely since moving into the penthouse, but had 2 client meetings this week that required her physical presence and files she hadn't thought to bring. She sat in the back of the car and watched the city move outside the window, and tried to feel normal, which was a condition she was beginning to suspect had a shorter shelf life than she'd imagined when she'd agreed to any of this. The office was ordinary and familiar in the way of spaces that carry the texture of daily life, and she felt her shoulders drop by a fraction when she walked in. Her desk, her files, the slightly broken chair she kept meaning to replace, the coffee maker that wasn't as good as Kong Jun's. She sat down and opened her laptop and started working, and for 3 hours she was simply a person doing her job, and it helped more than she wanted to admit. She left at 2. Sung-ho was in the lobby, exactly where she'd left him. She was at the car door when her phone rang. Unknown number, but a sole prefix she didn't recognize. She answered because she was the kind of person who answered unknown numbers, which was a habit she had developed in the early years of her business and had never broken. "Miss Bennet." A man's voice. Older. Smooth with the specific practiced smoothness of someone who conducts difficult conversations regularly and has long since stopped finding them difficult. "My name is Park Hyun-soo." She went still. Park Hyun-soo, Jae-min's father. She knew the name the way you know the names of people who exist at the edges of your life as context. Heard in conversation, registered, filed. She had met him once, briefly, years ago, at an event her stepfather had hosted, and she remembered a tall man with cold, precise eyes who had looked at her the way people look at background furniture. "How did you get this number?" she said. "That isn't important. I wanted to speak with you directly, without intermediaries." A pause. "I think you're an intelligent woman. I think you understand the situation you've placed yourself in, better than you're allowing yourself to acknowledge." Sung-ho was watching her from 3 feet away. She kept her face neutral with the practiced effort of someone who had been performing neutrality under pressure her entire life. "I'm listening," she said. "What you have with Seo Kong-jun isn't what you think it is," Park Hyun-soo said. "You walked into his world because he allowed you to. He allows nothing by accident." "I'd like you to ask yourself why a man like that picked up a woman he had never met at a family dinner and confirmed a lie she told in a moment of embarrassment. And I'd like you to consider whether the answer to that question serves your interests or his." She said nothing. "There are things you don't know," he said. "Come and talk with me, just a conversation. No obligation, no threat. I have no interest in harming you. I have an interest in ensuring that a young woman doesn't get caught in the wreckage of a business conflict she has nothing to do with." Another pause, and his voice shifted by a degree into something almost avuncular. "You deserve to know who you're living with." "Send me a location," she said. I'll think about it." She ended the call. Sung-ho was still watching her. She looked at him and said, "I need to make another call. Give me a minute." He nodded and stepped back. She called Kong Jun. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail, which was the first time she'd called him directly, and one of the few times in the arrangement she had genuinely needed him to answer. And the specific frustration of that, the way the unavailability landed, told her something about how far her dependency had already shifted without her full consent. She left a message. She said Park Hyun-soo had called. She said she was coming back to the building. She said they needed to talk. She got in the car. Sung-ho drove. She looked out the window at the city, and she held Park Hyun-soo's words in her hands like something found on the floor. "Ask yourself why." And she turned them over and examined them and tried to determine whether they were weapons or warnings, and found that she could not, with confidence, do either. He called back before she reached the building. He said, "Don't meet with him. I wasn't planning to without talking to you first." "Good." A pause. "What did he say?" She told him. He was quiet throughout in the way of someone listening to tactical information, not for emotional content, but for data. When she finished, he said, "He's trying to create doubt." "Is he wrong to?" She kept her voice even. "Is there something I should know that you haven't told me?" A pause. slightly longer than his usual processing pauses, and she cataloged that. "We'll talk tonight," he said. "That's not an answer. It's the answer I have right now. Come back to the building. Don't take any other calls from numbers you don't recognize." He paused. "Zarya, I hear you. Tonight." She put the phone in her bag and watched Sol move past the window, and she thought about Park Hyun-soo's voice and the specific, deliberate shape of what he'd said, and she thought about the way Kong Jun had paused, and she thought about all of it with the careful, increasingly uncomfortable attention of someone who is starting to suspect that the floor beneath them is not entirely solid. "Oh, I was there when she got back," which was unusual enough for mid-afternoon that she noticed it immediately. He was in the main room, standing at the window in the way she recognized as his thinking posture, still, facing outward, hands loose at his sides. And he turned when she came in and looked at her with something that was not quite the expression she knew from their kitchen conversations. Something was off. She felt it before she could name it. "You're here," she said. "I moved some things." He turned fully to face her. "Sit down." "I'll stand." He looked at her for a moment with that full attention, and she saw the small adjustment in his jaw that she had begun to read as the external indicator of him deciding something internally. "Park Hyun-soo told you to question the circumstances under which we met." "Yes." "And you're questioning them." "I'm standing here, which means I came back instead of calling a cab from my office, which should tell you something about where I'm at." She looked at him steadily. "But yes, I'm asking." He was quiet. The quiet had a different quality than usual. Not the stillness of processing, but the stillness of someone standing at a threshold they have known was coming. "I knew who you were before the dinner," he said. "The room didn't change. The light was the same, the river was the same outside, the city was still going." But she felt the words land in her body the way cold water lands, total, immediate, inescapable. "Explain that," she said. Her voice was very even. She was working very hard to keep it that way. "I've had ongoing intelligence on the Han family for approximately 2 years. Financial surveillance, movement tracking, relationship mapping." He held her gaze with the steady, deliberate quality of someone delivering information they know will cause harm and have decided to do it cleanly, rather than soft. "You appeared in that monitoring as a peripheral figure, the daughter who didn't fit, the one who was used as social filler when needed and otherwise kept at a distance." He paused. "I had a file on you, Zarya. Photographs, work history, financial records, the relationship with Jae-min." The silence lasted long enough for the information to fully arrive. "You knew about Jae-min," she said. "Yes?" "Before the dinner?" "Yes." "You knew he had ended things with me and was engaged to my stepsister?" "Yes." She looked at him, and for a moment the only thing she could hear was her own breathing, which was steadier than it had any right to be, because the part of her that had learned to function under sustained emotional assault was doing its job, doing it automatically, holding the line while the rest of her processed what she was looking at. "The dinner," she said. "You were there." "The dinner was a scheduled monitoring opportunity. Han Sung-jae's social events are useful for... Were you going to make contact with me?" A pause. "Not initially. You weren't the target of the evening. But you knew. When I said your name, you already knew everything about me, and you stood up and put your hand on my shoulder and said, 'She's with me,' and you knew exactly what you were doing." "Yes," he said. No qualification, no softening, just the word. She turned away from him. She walked to the window and she stood there with her back to him, and she looked at the river and she breathed with the terrible, disciplined steadiness of someone who has learned that breaking down in front of people who hold power over you is a luxury you cannot afford. She thought about the kitchen at 2 in the morning. She thought about his hand covering hers under the dinner table for 2 seconds that she had cataloged and returned to and tried not to read too much into. She thought about the specific, devastating accuracy with which he had said, "You're good at surviving things that should have broken you," and she understood now the full shape of that he had known what those things were before he said it, that the observation had been built on a file, on surveillance, on 2 years of watching her life from a distance and noting its contours. She had felt seen. She had felt genuinely, carefully seen for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember. It had been research. "How much of it was real?" she said. She was still facing the window. "The coffee at 2 in the morning, the conversation about my mother, the dinner, your hand, Zarya. How much?" She turned around. Her eyes were dry and her voice was level, and she was deeply, completely furious, in the specific way of someone who has survived too much to fall apart and knows it, and finds it sometimes a gift, and sometimes its own kind of imprisonment. I need an answer. He looked at her, and she saw it. What she might have called in another context a crack, the very small but genuine breach in that controlled surface. You stopped being part of the strategy before the first week was over, he said. Everything after that, that's not an answer. It's the only answer I have. His voice had changed. The flatness was gone. Something underneath it, something she had glimpsed in fragments over the past weeks, was present without the covering. I had a file on you. I used the situation. Both of those things are true, and then you sat across from me in my office, and you told me you weren't nothing in the arrangement, and you looked me in the face and meant every word of it, and I... He stopped. A muscle in his jaw moved. I did not anticipate you. Don't, she said. Zarya, don't tell me I was the variable that changed the calculation. Don't give me the version where I'm the exception. Her voice was steady and sharp, and each word was placed with the deliberate precision of someone who knows that the only power they have left in this moment is in the accuracy of their language. You built the situation. You let me walk into it believing I had made a choice. Everything I decided in that office, everything I agreed to. I decided it without the information you had. That's not a deal. That's a trap I walked into because I was hurt and tired, and you were... She stopped. Her jaw tightened. You were exactly what I needed to believe in that moment, and you knew it. He said nothing. Did you know he was going to mock me at the dinner? She said. Jaimin. A pause that lasted 1 second too long. You knew, she said. The understanding arrived with the cold, sickening clarity of a picture coming into focus. You knew how that evening was likely to go. You were there because you knew I would be there, and you knew the family dynamic, and you... She stopped. She pressed her fingers against her sternum briefly, the physical reflex of someone whose chest has gone very tight, and she made herself drop the hand. Tell me you didn't engineer it. I didn't engineer it, he said. The words were immediate, and she believed them, which was its own kind of problem. That she still believed his unqualified statements, that her trust in his direct denial was intact even now. What happened at the table was not planned. You saying my name was not planned. My response, he paused, was partly calculation and partly something I haven't entirely identified. That's supposed to make it better. No, he said quietly. It's not. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. The city was enormous and indifferent outside, and the light was going the particular gray gold of Seoul in late afternoon, and she stood in the most expensive room she had ever occupied in her life and felt poorer than she had felt in a very long time. I'm going to my room, she said. I need you to not be here when I come out. He held her gaze for another moment. Then he picked up his jacket from the chair where it had been draped, and he moved toward the door with his characteristic quietness. And he paused with his hand on the frame and said, without turning, Everything after the first week was real. I know you have no reason to believe that. I'm telling you anyway. Then he was gone. She stood in the empty room with the sound of the city below, and she pressed both palms flat against the window glass, and let the cold of it move up through her hands and into her arms, and she breathed until the tightness in her chest found some kind of accommodation with the air around it. She stayed like that for a long time. Then her phone buzzed. Not a call. A text. From a number she didn't recognize, and when she opened it there were 3 words and a link, and the 3 words were, look at this. And the link resolved to a document when she clicked it, and the document was on Kong Jun's business letterhead, and it was dated 11 months ago, 8 months before the dinner, and it was a strategic brief, and her name appeared in it 6 times with annotations, and the annotations included a phrase she had to read 3 times before she could process it, a phrase in clean professional language that said, in the particular sanitized vocabulary of strategic planning, that her emotional vulnerability relative to the Park Han family structure made her a potentially viable. Her phone rang. It was Sung Ho from the lobby, and his voice had the specific, controlled urgency of someone delivering bad news with professional restraint. And what he said was that there were 2 men in the lobby who were not building security and who had come through a side entrance that should have been locked and who were asking, at the front desk, for her by name. And Zarya stood in the penthouse with the document on her screen and the city burning below her and the river holding everything's light, and she understood, with total terrible clarity, that Park Hyun-soo had not called her to warn her. He had called her to make sure she was standing alone when the next move came. She moved before she finished thinking. That was the thing she would remember afterward. Not a decision, exactly, but a physical event, the body overriding the brain's need to process and simply acting, because the brain was still standing in the rubble of everything she'd just read, and the body understood that standing in rubble was not a survivable long-term position. She closed the document. She closed the app. She looked at the room with the rapid functional assessment of someone who had suddenly completely understood that the space she was in was not safe. Her bag was on the desk. She grabbed it. Phone, keys, the small notebook, the external drive where she kept client backups. She swept them in with the automatic muscle memory of someone who has packed quickly before, and she was at the door when she stopped. Sung-ho had said 2 men in the lobby asking for her by name. Sung-ho was in the lobby, which meant the lobby was already complicated, which meant the elevator was already complicated. She called him back. He answered on the first ring. "Where are they now?" she said. "Still at the desk. Building security is engaged. 2 minutes, maybe less, before it escalates." "Is there another way out?" A pause. "Service elevator. Kitchen level. I'll text you the code." "Do it." She ended the call. The text came in 6 seconds. She moved through the penthouse toward the kitchen and the secondary door she had noticed on her first day, and filed away with the specific, automatic attention of someone who always knew where the exits were. And she hit the service corridor at a pace that was just below running, because running in a corridor makes sound, and sound was information she was not willing to give to anyone right now. The service elevator was smaller and slower and smelled of cleaning supplies, and it took 45 seconds to reach the kitchen level, which was the longest 45 seconds she had experienced in recent memory. She watched the numbers change with her back against the wall, and her bag pressed to her chest, and her mind doing what it had always done under extreme pressure. Not shutting down, but sharpening, the way cold sharpens things, cutting away everything except the immediate operational question. The kitchen level was empty. She came out into a delivery corridor, concrete and fluorescent lit, and found the exterior door and pushed it open into the cold air of the building's service entrance, which faced a narrow alley running parallel to the main street. She stood in the alley for 3 seconds, deciding. She called Kang Jun. It rang. Once. Twice. She was on the verge of ending it and trying Ji Yeon when he picked up, and his voice was immediate and different, already alert, already reading something in the single ring count or the hour or some other variable she couldn't identify. "Where are you?" he said. Not hello. "Service alley behind the building. There are 2 men inside asking for me by name. Sung-ho is managing them, but don't move." His voice had changed entirely. The controlled evenness was still there, but the register beneath it had dropped to something operational and total. "I'm 8 minutes out. Stay in the alley, stay against the wall. Don't go back inside." "Kang Jun." She said his name and stopped. A brief pause. "I know," he said. 8 minutes. He ended the call. She pressed her back against the concrete wall and breathed. The alley was cold and smelled of exhaust and wet pavement, and somewhere above her the city was going about its business with magnificent indifference, and she stood there with the document still burning in her phone's recent memory and the specific physical sensation of someone whose trust has been structurally damaged, and she thought, with the clarity that comes when everything else strips away. She was not going to let Park Hyun-soo use what she'd found tonight as the mechanism for her own destruction. Whatever Kang Jun had done, whatever the file had said, Park Hyun-soo had sent it to her at exactly the moment 2 men were arriving downstairs, and that timing was not coincidence. That timing was engineering, and she was done. She was completely and permanently done, being someone else's variable. The black car came around the corner of the alley at 7 minutes, not 8. He came out of the car before it fully stopped, and he moved toward her with a speed and directness that had none of the economy she associated with him in ordinary circumstances. And when he reached her, he put both hands on her arms and looked at her face with an attention that was not the measured, cataloging attention she knew, but something rawer and less controlled. And he said, "Are you hurt?" "No." He exhaled. One breath, sharp and through the nose. The exhale of a man releasing something he'd been holding since the phone rang. He kept his hands on her arms for another second and then released her and turned, and she could see from his profile that his jaw was set hard. "Inside the building or outside?" he said. "Inside still, last I heard. Sung-ho was—" His phone was already at his ear. He spoke in rapid Korean that she caught the edges of. instructions, locations, specific names that landed on the other end and clearly moved people, because he ended the call 40 seconds later and said, "They're contained. They won't be in that building again." He paused. "Or anywhere that requires the use of their hands." She looked at him. He looked back at her, and the rawness was still there, imperfectly covered, and she thought about the document and the annotations and her name 6 times on his business letterhead. And she thought about his hands on her arms 30 seconds ago, and she held both things simultaneously because that was the truth of the situation. Both things were true, and she was tired of the world offering her only the simple versions. "I read the document," she said. "Park Hyun-soo sent it." Something moved through his face. "When?" "Same time Sung-ho called. Coordinated." He was quiet for a moment. "What it said about you?" "I know what it said. It was written 11 months ago. The language in it." He stopped. His jaw worked. "There are things in my business that are written in a particular way because that is how these things are written. It does not reflect—" "Not tonight," she said. Her voice was flat and steady and meant it. "I cannot do that conversation tonight. Tonight I need to know what is happening and what comes next. Everything else waits." He held her gaze. Then he nodded, once, with the quality of someone accepting terms. "Get in the car." They drove to a secondary location, not the penthouse, not his office, but a building in Seongdong-gu that she didn't recognize, a nondescript mid-rise that turned out to contain a floor of rooms used, she gathered, for exactly this category of situation, off-grid, secured, unknown to anyone outside a very tight circle. The room they brought her to was plain and clean and warm and had 2 chairs and a table and no windows, which should have felt like a threat, but felt instead like the specific, deliberate safety of a room that couldn't be seen into. 3 of his people were there. She recognized one from the penthouse building, the others she didn't know. They spoke in Korean around a table with a laptop open and maps, and she sat in a chair against the wall and drank the coffee someone brought without being asked, and she watched Kong Jun work. I was different here. Not different from her exactly. He still turned to check her position with a regularity that she noticed and cataloged, but different in the environment, the way a tool is different when it's being used for exactly the purpose it was made for. He moved through the information with the controlled ferocity of someone for whom this kind of crisis was not an aberration but a native terrain, and the people around him responded to him with the specific automatic deference of people who have decided without reservation that this is the person to follow when things become serious. She heard Jae-min's father's name. She heard the port facility name, Incheon. She heard what sounded like a location, repeated twice, with emphasis. She stood up and went to the table. Kong Jun looked at her. "Tell me what's happening," she said. "A beat." He looked at his people, then back at her, and he made the decision visible in real time, the small adjustment of a man recalibrating access. Park Hyun-soo moved tonight because he thinks the timeline on the property acquisition is accelerating. He's trying to force a negotiation by creating leverage. You are the leverage. He paused. The 2 men at the building were not there to hurt you. They were there to take you somewhere he controlled. A negotiating piece. Yes. She looked at the map on the laptop. A waterfront location. She could see the river markers, the port infrastructure. Is that where they would have taken me? One of 2 locations. We're narrowing it. He looked at her steadily. This ends tonight. Park Hyun-soo made the mistake of moving before he was ready because he thought I was distracted. Something in his voice on that, a hard, quiet thing. He was correct that I was distracted. He was wrong about what that meant for his odds. She looked at him for a moment. "What do you need from me?" "Nothing. Stay here. Stay." "What do you need from me?" she said again. Flat, specific. The voice she used when she was done being managed. He looked at her with something that was recognition and something that was not entirely comfortable to receive. Then he said, "Your stepfather, Han Sung-jae. If we can confirm his current location, it tells us which of the 2 sites Park is using tonight. They've been in communication all week. Your mother would know where he is." She already had her phone out. Her mother answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been awake, which meant something had already reached her. "Zarya, what's happening? People have been— Where is Appa tonight? Right now. Don't ask me why." A pause. "He had a dinner in Mapo. He should be—" The sound of movement, checking. "He just messaged. He's at the Incheon facility. He said it's a late inspection. Thank you." She ended the call. She looked at Kong Jun. "Incheon." He turned to his people immediately, and the room changed temperature. She was not supposed to go. That had been made clear in the rapid, low-voiced exchange that followed, and she had accepted it for approximately 12 minutes, which was how long it took her to process that accepting it was not a choice she was actually capable of making tonight. Park Hyun-soo had used her as a variable for the last time. Whatever happened at that waterfront facility, she was not going to be sitting in a windowless room in Seongdong-gu waiting to be informed of the outcome of her own situation. She told Sung-ho, who had arrived at the secondary location 20 minutes after them and whose face showed nothing but whose eyes showed everything. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said very quietly, "I'll get a vest." The drive to Incheon took 40 minutes at the speed they drove it. She sat in the back beside Sung-ho, and she did not look at her phone, and she did not speak, and she breathed with the steady, deliberate pace of someone conserving everything for what came next. In the front passenger seat, Kong Jun was on calls for 30 of those 40 minutes, speaking in the quiet, rapid Korean of someone coordinating multiple moving parts. And she watched the back of his head and the set of his shoulders, and she thought about the document and the annotations, and his hands on her arms in the alley, and the specific terrible complexity of being a person who is simultaneously furious at someone and afraid for them. The port facility was visible from the highway approach. Industrial lights, the shapes of cargo cranes against the dark sky, the smell of salt water and diesel that hit when Sung-ho cracked a window. They came off the highway onto a service road, and the car slowed, and Kong Jun ended his last call and turned to look at her. And the look was not strategic or measuring or any of the looks she had cataloged over the past weeks. It was direct and undefended, and it had the quality of something said in a language with no other words for it. "You should not be here," he said. "I know. If something happens, I know." A pause. He looked at her for another second, and then he said very quietly, "Stay behind Sung-ho. Whatever you see, whatever happens, behind him." She nodded. He turned back to the front. The car stopped. Outside, the waterfront was dark and rain was starting. Not heavy, but the cold, insistent kind that got into everything. And as she stepped out of the car into the wet air, she could hear the river, or maybe the bay, moving somewhere in the dark beyond the cargo containers. There were 4 of them, Kong Jun, Sung-ho, and 2 others she didn't know, moving into the facility through a service gate that had been unlocked by someone, somewhere, in the 30 minutes of calls she'd listened to without understanding. She stayed behind Sung-ho the way she'd been told, and she moved through the dark between stacked containers that were enormous and maze-like, and smelled of rust and salt water, and the only sounds were their footsteps, and the rain, and the harbor moving somewhere, and her own pulse, which she could feel in her throat. They heard the voices before they saw the lights. A cluster of industrial lamps set up inside what looked like a loading bay, the kind of temporary lighting that meant people had set up intentionally rather than been found in existing light. She could see shadows, could hear, in the particular acoustic of concrete and metal, the sound of more than one person speaking, and then one voice she didn't recognize, and then her stepfather's voice, Han Sung-jae. She would know it anywhere, after 20 years, the specific cadence of a man who was accustomed to rooms organizing around him and who was now, she could hear immediately, operating in a situation where that was not happening. His voice had a quality she had never heard in it before, something stripped of its usual confidence, something that sounded like fear. Kong Jun had stopped. He was looking at her. She realized she had stopped too and was looking toward the light, and something in her face had apparently broadcast something, because he said, very low, "He's not the target. He's a bystander they're using. He's not going to be harmed." She looked at him. She believed it and didn't believe it in equal measure, and she pressed neither because there was no room for it. He touched her arm briefly. 1 second, 2 fingers, the lightest possible contact, and then he was moving again, and she followed, and they came around the last container and into the edge of the light, and she saw the full shape of what Park Hyun-soo had built tonight, laid out in the loading bay like a terrible diorama. Her stepfather was standing near the far wall with 2 men beside him, whose positioning communicated with absolute clarity that he was not there by choice. Park Hyun-soo himself was standing in the center of the bay, and he was older than she remembered from the one time she'd seen him. Older and harder, with the particular physical quality of a man who had survived things that required surviving and had not come out of it softened. There were 4 other men in the bay, positioned with a deliberateness that her untrained eye nonetheless recognized as tactical. And then Park Hyun-soo looked toward the edge of the light, where they had emerged, and she watched his face process the arrival of Seo Kang-jun with an expression that moved through several registers in rapid succession: calculation, reassessment, something briefly adjacent to doubt, before settling into the specific, controlled blankness of a man who had prepared for this possibility. His eyes moved past Kang-jun. Found her. And he smiled. "I wasn't sure you'd come yourself," he said. His voice was exactly as it had been on the phone. Smooth, practiced, carrying the artificial warmth of someone for whom warmth had always been a tool. "Either of you." His gaze held Zarya for a moment. "She saw the file, I take it. This ends tonight, Hyun-soo." Kang-jun's voice in this space was different from any version she had heard. Not louder, quieter. The kind of quiet that had density. "Release Han. Whatever you think this buys you, it's already spent." "I think it buys me a conversation," Park Hyun-soo said. "A real one. Without lawyers and proxies, just the two of us and the actual terms." He looked at Zarya again. "She was always just a variable to you, I told her that. Did you explain the document, or did she figure it out herself?" Kang-jun said nothing. "She did," Park Hyun-soo said, sounding almost impressed. "Intelligent woman. You should have been more careful." He tilted his head, and his eyes on Zarya were sharp and cold beneath the avuncular surface. "Do you understand what you are to him? Even now? You're the reason he's standing in this building tonight, instead of negotiating from a position of strength. You've been a liability from the moment he put his hand on your shoulder in that restaurant and decided sentiment was a strategy." Kang-jun moved, not toward Park Hyun-soo, toward Zarya, and it happened in less than a second, the gap between Park Hyun-soo finishing his sentence and the sound, somewhere in the shadows above the loading bay, of something moving that shouldn't have been moving, and Kang-jun crossed the distance between them and put himself directly in front of her with his back to whatever was in the shadows. And she heard, the sound was a shot, single, sharp, the kind of sound that doesn't echo the way movies suggest, but instead arrives and then lives in the body of everyone who heard it. A fact, sudden and irreversible, written into the air of the loading bay before anyone had time to process it. Zarya felt the impact before she understood it. Kang-jun's body lurching forward into hers with a weight and momentum that was not a choice but physics, and she caught him, or tried to, her hands finding his jacket, and his arm finding the wall beside her, and both of them going down to one knee against the concrete with the grinding reality of weight and pain and the cold, wet floor of a harbor facility at midnight. She heard Sung-ho's voice, heard running, heard other sounds she catalogued later but could not process in the moment, because in the moment there was only Kang-jun's breathing against her ear, fast and shallow and wrong, and her own hands pressing against the left side of his torso where his jacket was dark in a way that was spreading. "I've got you," she said. It came out very quiet. Not the managed, controlled quiet she had trained into herself over 26 years, but something underneath that, something that had no performance in it at all. He stopped. His jaw was tight, and his face had the particular grayish quality of a person whose body is managing a serious insult and managing it at cost. "I'm all right." "You're not, relatively." A breath that was almost, under any other circumstances, something she might have called a laugh. "Relatively all right?" Around them, the loading bay had become a different kind of chaos from the one that had existed 10 seconds ago. The controlled, escalatory tension of a standoff replaced by the fractured, urgent chaos of its collapse. She could see Sung-ho and the two others moving with speed and precision toward Park Hyun-soo's men, and she could hear voices, and she could hear her stepfather's voice among them. High and frightened and more human than she had ever heard Han Sung-jae sound in 20 years of knowing him, and she stayed exactly where she was with her hands pressed to Kang-jun's side and her shoulder supporting his weight, and she talked to him in the steady, unbroken way of someone who understands that voice is an anchor. "Stay with me, keep breathing. Don't you dare manage this, just breathe." His hand came up and covered hers, not to move it, just to hold it. "The shooter," he said. "Sung-ho has it." She could hear that. The specific terminal sounds of a situation being resolved in the shadows above. "It's handled. Look at me. Stay here." He looked at her. His eyes were dark and clear, and in them she saw the thing she had been seeing in fragments for weeks, and refusing to fully read. The thing that was not strategy, not calculation, not the operational regard of a man managing a useful variable. Something stripped of every professional layer by the specific, impartial democracy of a bullet and a concrete floor. "I saw him move," he said. His voice was strained, but each word was deliberate. "In the shadows. I had 3 seconds, maybe less. You don't have to explain it. I want to." A breath. His hand tightened over hers. "I want you to know it wasn't the arrangement. It wasn't strategy. I saw him move and I moved and I didn't think about anything except—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "You." She looked at him in the terrible industrial light of the harbor facility, and she felt the thing she had been holding at arm's length for weeks. Close the remaining distance, and she pressed her hands harder against his side and said, very quietly, "You're not allowed to tell me that and then die in a shipping facility. That is not an acceptable sequence of events." His mouth moved. This time it was unmistakably the ghost of a smile, even through the gray and the pain. "Noted." Sung-ha was there 30 seconds later, crouching on Kong Jun's other side, already on his phone, and she heard the word for ambulance and gave up the management of the next phase to people who were trained for it. And she stayed exactly where she was, because leaving was not a thing her body was willing to do. The hospital was in Incheon, close enough that the ambulance arrived at the facility in 11 minutes, which she counted. She rode in the back with him and held his hand, which was not something she examined or justified. It was simply what she did, and it was what he allowed, and that was the full extent of the negotiation. "I was in surgery for 4 hours. The bullet had entered below the left shoulder blade and missed the lung by a margin that the surgeon described, with the particular neutral professionalism of someone who delivers these assessments multiple times a week, as fortunate. There was damage to muscle and tissue that would require significant recovery. He would be in the hospital for several days. He would be in pain for considerably longer." She sat in the surgical waiting area in her rain-damp clothes with dried blood on her hands that she had washed twice and not entirely removed. And she stared at the wall, and she did not cry, because crying was a release, and release required the permission of safety, and she had not yet assessed whether this was a safe place to release anything. Her phone had 14 missed calls. 3 from her mother, 2 from Ji-yeon, 1 from a number she identified when she scrolled to it as her stepfather's. She called Ji-yeon first, Chi-yeon, in the manner of someone who had clearly been awake for hours and had processed the relevant information and was now operating purely in the register of effective action, told her that Kong Jun's people had detained Park Hyun-soo and 3 of his associates at the facility, that documentation of the Park family's financial crimes, the port manipulation, the bribery, the decade of infrastructure extortion, had been delivered to 3 separate law enforcement contacts simultaneously, that Jaemin's father would not be returning to the life he had been living. She said it with the same voice she used to schedule gallery appearances. "And Han Sung-jae," Zarya said, "released at the facility. He was not involved in the operational plan. He was leverage, as Mr. Seo assessed." A pause. "He asked about you." She said nothing for a moment. "Thank you, Ji-yeon." "He'll want to see you when he comes out of surgery," Ji-yeon said. "He'll deny it, but he will." She ended the call and sat with the phone in her lap and looked at her hands and thought about 26 years of being the person who absorbed what rooms decided to give her and called that living. And she thought about standing in a service alley in the rain and reading a document that told her she had been seen as a variable. And she thought about a man covering her hand with his on a concrete floor and saying "you" with the specific stripped quality of a word that has had everything performative removed from it by circumstance. She had not resolved the document. She had not resolved the file, the photographs, the 2 years of surveillance, the annotations that described her emotional architecture in the vocabulary of strategic planning. Those things were real, and they had happened, and they would require, at some point, a conversation she did not have the energy for tonight. But she understood, sitting in a hospital waiting room at 2 in the morning with blood. She couldn't entirely wash off her hands. That resolution was not the same as simplicity. The 2 things could be true simultaneously. That she had been watched and assessed and found useful, and that somewhere in the middle of that calculation, something had changed that couldn't be uncalculated. That the man who had pulled her file had also stepped in front of a bullet in the 3 seconds available to him, and that 3 seconds was not enough time for strategy. She understood that. She didn't forgive it yet. She didn't need to yet. She just needed to sit with the understanding that both things were true and let that be sufficient for tonight. "I was awake when she was allowed in," which surprised her. She had expected to find him sedated, reduced to the ordinary vulnerability of the unconscious, and instead he was in the bed with the particular rigid stillness of someone managing significant pain with maximum discipline and a face that, when she appeared in the doorway, changed by a fraction so small she would have missed it 6 weeks ago. "You're still here," he said. His voice was thinner than usual, the rawness of anesthesia and effort. "I was in the waiting room," Ji-yeon said. He watched her as she came in and sat in the chair beside the bed. "You should go home. Sleep." "I will. I wanted to check first." She looked at him in the hospital light, which was not flattering to anyone and was especially unsparing for someone in the specific condition he was in, diminished by loss of blood and surgery and the particular vulnerability of the body when it has been seriously reminded that it is a body. She found that she could look at him like this without the complicated management of her own reactions that the past weeks had required. Something in the night had resolved that. How bad is it? Manageable. That's not a medical assessment. The medical assessment is 4 to 6 weeks, reduced mobility, physical therapy. He looked at the ceiling briefly and then back at her. "I've had worse." "That's not reassuring. It wasn't meant to be." A pause. His voice had the careful quality of someone choosing words under physical duress, which meant they were the actual words, not the managed ones. "Park Hyun-soo is contained," Ji-yeon told me. "His assets will be frozen within 48 hours. The documentation that was delivered tonight, it's comprehensive. He won't negotiate out of it." He paused. "Jaemin's position in his father's company is already public. The engagement announcement will be a footnote by the end of the week." She looked at him for a moment. "I don't care about Jaemin," she said. "I want you to know that. Whatever I felt about him, it's been over for a long time. Tonight clarified that completely." She folded her hands in her lap. "I didn't come here because of anything that started with him." He was quiet. "The file," she said. "I need to say something about it, and then I need you to hear it and not argue with it." "All right. What you did was wrong." She said it without heat, which made it land differently than heat would have. "Keeping that from me. Using what you knew about me without telling me you knew it. I walked into your office and I made a decision based on incomplete information and you let me make it, and that is, it's a violation. Even if what came after was real, it doesn't cancel." She held his gaze. "I need you to understand that I know the difference between the strategy and what came after, and I know the strategy was wrong, and I'm not going to rewrite it as something acceptable because the rest of it turned out to be true." He said nothing for a long moment. His eyes on hers were completely steady and completely open in the way they got in the late undefended hours. The way she had learned was not a performance. "I know," he said. "I knew it before you said it. I'm not done." "I know that too." "I'm also not leaving," she said. "I want to be clear about that separately. I'm not leaving because I can separate the thing that was wrong from the thing that became real, and because I think you can too, and because I have spent my entire life walking away from situations that failed to give me what I needed, and I am finished. I am completely finished with walking away from things I actually want because the circumstances aren't clean." She paused. "Nothing has ever been clean. It doesn't get cleaner by leaving." He looked at her for a long time. The room was very quiet, and outside the window, Seoul was beginning the gray pre-dawn reconfiguration of a city, shifting from night into morning, the particular colorless hour when everything is possible and nothing has yet been decided. "You want this," he said, "not a challenge, not doubt, just the weight of someone needing to hear it said plainly." "I want this," she said, "under different terms, going forward." "Name them. No more files. No more using what you know about me before you tell me you know it. If something affects me, I hear it from you first, always." She met his eyes. "And you stop deciding what I can handle. I've been handling things longer than you've known I existed." "Yes," he said. "That's it? Just yes?" "I have 4 to 6 weeks of restricted mobility and a significant debt," he said, and his voice had the very faint, very controlled quality she had learned was as close as he came to dry humor. "I'm not in a strong negotiating position." She looked at him. She felt the thing in her chest that had been compressed for weeks, by the arrangement, by the discovery, by the night's violence and its aftermath, begin, cautiously, to take up its actual space. "Go to sleep," she said. "I'll be in the waiting room." "You said you were going home, Set." "I lied." She stood up. "Go to sleep." She saw his hand move on the blanket. a small reaching motion that stopped before it completed, the gesture of a man who is not accustomed to asking for things and has not yet fully learned how. She sat back down. She put her hand over his. He turned his hand and held it with the careful grip of someone managing pain and not willing to let go for a different reason entirely. She stayed until he slept, which took less time than she expected because his body was done regardless of what his will had to say about it. Then she sat for a while longer in the chair beside his bed, with his hand slack in hers, and the city going from black to gray outside the window. And she breathed the specific, depleted, alive air of someone on the other side of something enormous. The weeks that followed had the quality of reconstruction, slow, unglamorous, the work of building things that weren't built correctly the first time. Park Hyun-soo was formally indicted on financial crime charges that, when the full documentation was made public, ran to 47 pages and implicated 3 port officials, 2 city administrators, and a network of shell companies that had been operating for 11 years. Jaemin's involvement was peripheral. He was his father's son in the ways that mattered professionally and had profited from what he hadn't asked questions about, which was its own category of culpability and carried its own category of consequence. His finance company lost 2 major institutional clients within the week. His engagement to Yuna was not formally cancelled. It simply stopped being mentioned in any public context, which was its own form of ending. Han Sung-jae came to see her. He came alone, without her mother, which told her he had decided this needed to be a different kind of conversation than the ones their family was accustomed to having. And she met him in a coffee shop in Mapogu. Neutral ground, public, her choice. And he sat across from her with the look of a man who had spent several days arriving at something that cost him. "I was wrong," he said, "about the way I treated you, for a long time." He looked at his hands. "I told myself I'd provided what a father should provide. I was wrong about what that meant." She looked at him. Han Sung-jae was 61 years old and looked, in this light, more like a man than the concept of a patriarch she had carried in her mind for 2 decades, and that was its own strange, necessary revision. "You were absent," she said, "not cruel. There's a difference, and I know it, but absent has its own damage." He nodded. He didn't argue it or qualify it, which she respected in the way she respected any person who could receive an accurate assessment without flinching into self-defense. "I'm not looking for a different relationship than the one we have," she said carefully. "I don't need a father at 26 that I didn't have at 7, but I would accept an honest one, going forward, whatever that looks like." He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were wet, and she let that be what it was without making it the center of the conversation. "I would like that," he said. They finished their coffee. He paid. She let him. They walked to the door and he paused on the sidewalk and looked at her with a directness she didn't associate with him and said, "He came to me, Seo Kang-jun, 2 months before the dinner. He was asking about our finances, but he asked about you specifically. I didn't understand it then." She looked at him. "What did you tell him?" "The truth," he said simply. "That you were more than we ever gave you room to be." He paused. "I didn't know I knew that until I was saying it." She stood on the sidewalk in the Mapo afternoon light and let those words settle into the specific, complicated territory they belonged in. And then she said, "Thank you, Appa," and meant it with the portion of herself that was still capable of meaning it, which was smaller than it might have been and larger than she had expected. Her mother came later, on a Tuesday, which Zarya noted with a dark, private irony. She arrived at the office Zarya had moved into, a real office now, her own lease, not a desk in a shared space. And she sat across from her daughter, and she didn't perform and she didn't manage, and she cried, which Choi Eun-hee had not done in front of Zarya since she couldn't remember when. "I chose the family's comfort over your truth," her mother said. "Again and again. I told myself I was keeping the peace. I was keeping my position." She pressed her fingers against her mouth briefly. "I knew about Jaemin before the invitation. I knew for 3 months. I didn't tell you because telling you would have required me to do something about it, and I didn't want—" She stopped. "I didn't want the disruption." Zarya looked at her mother's face. The lines of it, the familiar architecture, the specific grief of a woman looking at the cost of her own choices. She felt the anger that was always there when she thought about this, and she felt it fully, without managing it, which was new. She let it exist in her chest for a moment, real and legitimate and earned. Then she said, "I know. I'm sorry. I know that too." She paused. It's not enough. I want you to know it's not enough and that I'm not going to pretend it is just to make the room more comfortable. That's finished. She held her mother's eyes. But it's a start. If you mean it as a start and not a conclusion. Her mother nodded. She looked older and more real and more human than she had looked in a long time, and that was, Zarya thought, maybe the most honest version of her she had ever seen, and the most honest version was the one she could work with. They did not hug. They would get there, maybe, over time, over the kind of time that was measured in consistent small actions rather than gestures. Her mother stood to leave and paused at the door and looked back, and for a moment she looked at Zarya the way she must have looked at her when she was very small, with an expression that didn't have strategy in it. You look like yourself, her mother said. I don't think I've ever seen that before. Zarya said nothing, but after her mother left, she sat at her desk in her own office, and she thought about that for a long time. What? I was 6 weeks out of surgery when she saw him on the roof. It was early spring, the specific, tentative spring of Seoul that arrives still carrying cold in its pockets, the air clear and sharp, and the city below going about its enormous life, with the indifferent energy of a thing that does not mark human turning points. She had come up to check a venue measurement for an event she was planning in the building. She had a contract now, a real one, with a hotel group that had approached her based on a referral from, she had eventually established, someone in Kong Jun's business circle who had attended the Wednesday dinner where she had looked at a room full of important men and engaged exactly the right one. She had not asked him to arrange it. She had asked him, specifically and in unambiguous language, not to. She had asked Ji-yeon, who had confirmed with the diplomatic neutrality of a person who served one master but respected this particular boundary, that the referral had come because Kim Dong-soo had told 2 colleagues that the woman at CEO's table was the most socially intelligent person in the room. She would take that. That was hers. I was standing at the railing looking at the river when she came through the rooftop door, and he turned at the sound, and she saw immediately that he was moving better. The residual stiffness still there, still visible in the way he shifted his weight, but less. 4 to 6 weeks had been accurate. He looked at her the way he looked at her now, which was different from the way he had looked at her for the first weeks of the arrangement, and different again from the way he had looked at her in the hospital. Something in it more settled, more deliberate, the look of a man who has decided what he is looking at and stopped reconsidering. Venue check, she said, holding up her notebook. I know, Ji-yeon told me. He paused. I wasn't waiting. I didn't say you were. A beat. The city moved below them, its thousands of lives going forward without pause, and the Han River held the evening light in long silver lines, and the air smelled of spring and the particular mineral quality of height. How's the shoulder? She said. Better. He turned back to the railing and she came to stand beside him, not touching, the space between them, the kind of space that is a choice and not a distance. The physical therapist says another 4 weeks and it's full function. Good. My mother wants to meet you, he said. The actual version, not the story. She looked at him. Is that your way of asking? It's my way of telling you she asked, and I said I would pass it along and the decision was yours. Diplomatically handled. I've had practice. He paused, and she heard in the pause something that was not the calculated quiet she had learned in the first weeks, but the ordinary human quiet of someone who has things to say and is taking the time to say them correctly. I'm restructuring the business. The parts that operated in sectors I inherited rather than chose. I've been working on it since the hospital. She looked at the river. Why are you telling me? Because it affects what I am, and what I am affects the relevant terms. He glanced at her, and the glance had that quality she had never found a clean word for. Not soft, not calculated, something that lived between them without a category. I'm not doing it because you asked me to. I'm doing it because lying in a hospital bed for 3 weeks gives a person a useful amount of time to look at the things they've built and ask whether they built them because they wanted them or because they were available. She considered this. And some of it I wanted. Some of it was available, and I was young enough and angry enough to take everything that was available without distinguishing. He was quiet for a moment. I've been distinguishing. She nodded. The city below is beginning its evening shift. Lights coming on in apartment windows. The river going from silver to gold to the deep, moving dark of full night. Seoul doing what it did every evening without requiring anyone's permission or attention. She thought about 26 years of standing at the edges of things. She thought about a pale cream envelope on a kitchen counter and a burgundy dress, and the decision, made somewhere between the third reading of a gold script name and the first glass of wine at a table that had never entirely wanted her, to stop diminishing herself to fit the space she'd been assigned. She thought about a man standing up from a table in a restaurant and saying, "She's with me," and all the ways that sentence had been true, and all the ways it had been complicated, and all the ways it had, in the end, despite and because of everything, turned out to matter. She thought about the kind of person she was now, standing on this roof, in this city, with her own office and her own contract and her own clear sight of what she was worth, which she had not arrived at because anyone had rescued her. She had arrived at it through the specific, unglamorous process of surviving the thing that had been intended to use her and coming out the other side knowing her own dimensions. "No secrets," she said. He looked at her. "No secrets. No games. No managed information. No decisions made about my life before I'm in the room." She turned to face him fully. "If that's the arrangement, then yes, I'll stay." I was quiet for a long moment. In the settling dark, his face had the quality she had learned was his truest expression, the one that appeared after the controlled layers had been down long enough that what was underneath had room to surface. Unhurried, unperformed, real in the specific way of things that have been tested and held. "No secrets," he said. "No games." He paused. "I can't promise you clean. My world isn't clean." "I didn't ask for clean," she said. "I asked for honest." He reached out and took her hand. Not the brief, deniable contact of dinner tables and dark cars, but a full, deliberate hold, fingers through fingers, his thumb settling over her knuckles with the quiet permanence of a man who has decided he is done being careful about what he reaches for. She let him. Below them Seoul burned and breathed and moved through its enormous, indifferent night, and the Han River held everything's light and gave none of it back, and Zaria Bennett, who had spent 26 years invisible in rooms that looked through her, who had been surveilled and strategized and nearly taken apart by people who saw her as a variable in their larger calculations, who had stood in service alleys in the rain and in hospital waiting rooms with dried blood on her hands, and in her own office on a Tuesday afternoon hearing for the first time what she had always been worth, stood on a rooftop above the city that had tried to swallow her and looked out at all of it and felt, for the first time she could accurately remember, like the full, complete, sufficient size of herself. Not because someone had chosen her, because she had. The city lights shimmered on the water below, and the spring air moved through the space between them, and neither of them spoke, because some things are large enough that they don't need words to hold them, and what they had built, through strategy and betrayal and blood, on a harbor floor and every difficult, honest conversation in a kitchen at 2 a.m, was exactly that kind of thing, large, real, fought for, theirs.